All right, we're recording now. Have a great meeting, everyone.
Okay, thank you. So first, thank you to everyone who is here. We are super excited to see so many participants. As the name suggests, this is really an open forum so that we can hear from you. I am the chair of the task force, and I'm joined by 3 co-presenters and committee members of our task force, as you can see on the screen. We are here to talk about a framework that we've created. So what we will be doing today, I can figure out how to advance the slides. There we go. Is we'll do a bit of background contextualization of what our task force is and what we set out to do, and then what we did. And then Jennifer will introduce the framework itself and then guide us in some Q&A, and most importantly, some feedback, which is really what we're interested in. Just a reminder, if you can mute your microphones, we'll be collecting all feedback and other questions, etc., via chat. As you can see, Robin is our chat moderator. So we'll take some pauses in between our presentation as it goes to answer questions that come up along the way, but really we'll try and leave as much time as possible for that Q&A and discussion and feedback section. But before we start, we're gonna contextualize the context, as it were, and help everyone kind of think about what this framework is about by doing a little icebreaker. So what we want you to do is think of a professional presentation that had an impact on you. Usually this is in librarianship, but it doesn't have to be. Our framework is centered on academic librarianship, so if that's what comes to mind, that's probably ideal, but it doesn't have to be. So think about where it happened, who it was, maybe what the content was, and why it had an impact on you. And maybe how it impacted you in some way. And now that you've taken a moment to think about that, here are some different ways in which you may start to think about or characterize the kind of impact that it had. So maybe it impacted your day-to-day responsibilities as a librarian or other information professional. Maybe it impacted your future scholarship or research outputs, publications, or maybe it had some other type of impact altogether. Who knows? So the question is, how would things be different if the presenter could discover that type of impact? So maybe something like emailing the presenter afterwards, or having a way that was easily discoverable, so that that person knew about the impact that they had on you. So that is some of the context of what we are starting to tackle with our task force. So we are the Impactful Scholarship and Metrics Task Force, which is a long and mouthful of a name. And this is our charge. It was a fairly ambitious charge, I would say, but our main task was to create a framework that recommends practices for evaluation of academic librarian scholarship, while also making it inclusive of a wide variety of different academic scholarship, research outputs, and type of academic appointments. Recognizing that librarians have very different scholarly expectations at different jobs, and encouraging impactful scholarship within our field. So a lot to tackle. Here's how we started to tackle it. Our goals were to better align institutional expectations with actual practice in our field, and give librarians more tools and potential options for being able to describe and capture impact directly and indirectly. And as Jennifer will cover in a bit more detail when she's introducing the framework, that it's really meant as a conversation starter, to have institutional level conversations. At the end of the day, we didn't feel like having any one prescriptive framework really made sense. So this is really bringing forth possibilities that will then get interpreted at the institutional level in terms of meaningful guidance. So step 1 of what our task force did was to gather as much information as possible. So we had 3 different main categories. of information that we were trying to uncover. Category 1 is what has been done in other disciplines and societies. So we know that ACRL didn't have anything, but were there any other models that we could draw from that have been created for perhaps other disciplines or similar situations that we could use as a basis? Part 2, group 2 was what kind of institutional expectations currently exist for academic librarians and how is impact measured? And then part 3 is what do academic librarians think about measuring scholarship? So we did a large survey. And I am not going to go into complete detail. We're gonna kind of hit the highlights of what we found with this information gathering. But just to note, our very last slide at the end of this presentation has a link to a presentation we did at ACRL earlier this year at the conference that went a little more in depth into our methodology and some more of those findings. If you are curious, you can take a look at those slides to get some more details. This is more how it's going to relate to the actual framework that we created more than anything. So what did we learn? A few things, some of which we were already aware of, starting with the Becker model, which some people may be aware of is a model that was created for biomedical practice specifically, and is one of the only very detailed examples of a similar kind of framework to measure research output and evaluate it. And most importantly, that they divide impact into 5 discrete areas that you can see listed there. So this is really one of the only working models that we had to draw from that takes this idea of impact and starts to break it down in a concrete way for that discipline. And you can see a direct link to the Becker model in the chat if you care to look at it now or later. These slides will also be available, and there are hyperlinks as well. So you don't have to copy and paste from the chat right now if you don't want to. Second, when we were doing our review of institutional guidelines, there were some institutions that specifically mentioned Ernst Boyer's categories of scholarship, which likewise breaks down this idea, this large idea of impact and scholarship into different areas. So that was another idea that we found inspirational. And overall, when we were looking at institutional guidelines, we did not find a whole lot of specifics. So the overall focus was on types of outputs that were preferred or required, rather than what impact or evaluation should really look like. And another thing that definitely stood out as a common theme amongst lots of the institutional documentation was the concept of peer review being preferred or the most highly ranked in terms of different research outputs. So those are some of the main findings. As you can see, not a whole lot of very in-depth information to go on. And just before I turn this over to Jennifer, who's going to start to talk about the framework itself, some things to note that have something to do with the framework itself, which doesn't live in a vacuum, and we don't intend for it to stand alone as a piece of work when it is finalized, because there are some other initiatives that are happening, specifically within ACRL, that are going to definitely have very real consequences. I don't know if consequence is the right word, but will impact this discussion in very meaningful ways. 2 documents in particular that we found to be working in concert with our own framework. One is a statement regarding open access for academic librarians that was published in April. And as you can see on the screen, in it, ACRL recommends a standard practice that academic librarians publish in open access venues. And so we definitely knew that this was going to be something that would impact what this framework looks like, as well as equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I think possibly many of us know is a main core priority of ACRL right now. The research and scholarly environment, I'm probably screwing up the name of that committee. They, in June, published outline priorities and plans to reshape the system of scholarly communications itself in recognition of the ways in which traditional scholarship have not aimed towards equity and inclusivity. So these are two very big concepts that really change the nature of scholarly communication themselves in ways that are mostly unknown at this point. So pretty much our recommendation is that institutions are going to need to figure out ways and talk about ways to acknowledge and value all of these concepts and how they interplay with each other. Concepts of evaluation versus equity versus open access, and discuss how that might affect their own priorities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
So as we developed this framework, one of the things that we wanted to keep in mind was that we wanted this new framework to be a lot more diverse. We wanted it to fit a variety of librarians and their positions. We wanted it to fit different modes of communication, the different varieties of publishing that are out there. And so and the different institutional standards that are out there for all the different varieties of institutions that abound. So with that in mind, we developed two different categories of impact with the framework. And so we have the scholarly impact and the practitioner impact with two different sort of frameworks developed for both. With the scholarly impact, sort of the more traditional with impact measures, citation metrics, et cetera. And the practitioner impact following more qualitative metrics and all metrics, and less traditional measures and that sort of thing, along with other evidence of impact. Go ahead, Rachel. We are still including journal level metrics in the framework. We looked at several models, and including tiers of preferred outlets, the peer surveys of core academic librarianship journals, but we decided to keep the framework neutral on measurement. We are recommending to ACRL that they, for the adoption of peer surveys for future use and standardization in the field, but we felt that that was sort of beyond the scope of what our group was to take on. The framework is meant to sort of frame the possibilities for scholarly evaluation, again, not to prescribe what any one institution or group should be doing, just recommend practice. We also felt that the framework is really supposed to be sort of an entryway for discussion into the support of individual framing of metrics. So to really help encourage everyone to talk about, like what does it mean to have open access, or what does it mean to have a practitioner framework for us in our institution. Okay, yeah. And here is the link to the full framework so that you can take a look at it. And we have a snippet in the next slide so that you can see sort of how things are framing out. So as you can see, in the journal article, there's the traditional citation count, the peer review, the journal acceptance. The practitioner impact would be views or downloads, the shares and mentions, as Rachel referred to earlier, like how is a presenter's work being seen and affected, direct evidence of use, conferences, the refereed proposal process under the scholarly impact, attendance, were you invited to present, under the practitioner, again, the direct evidence of use, the inclusion of the materials, again, views and downloads, that sort of thing. And so with that, with having the link to the framework and seeing the snippet, we're now going to open it up to your questions and answers, your feedback. And we have some general questions that we would like to start with. So the first one is, like, how do you envision the framework being used by your institution or library? or even more personally, how would you use this framework?
Hi, this is Ellie Dweck from Boise State. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. My library just finished doing a rubric for annual evaluations, which is related to but isn't the same as our annual or our tenure and promotion process, and is now appointed a task force, which I'm chairing, to do pretty much what this, to implement a framework for our library that is probably a little bit more, it'll probably be more prescriptive and less open, but our guidelines to include in the T&P process.
Sure. So perhaps this would be something that you could use to inform that process?
Yep, that's why I'm here. Thank you. I'm glad I learned about this.
You're welcome. That's what we're hoping for.
This is Robin, chat moderator for the group, and we've had a couple of really great comments to come in for this discussion. And also a comment. But first, just to go to these two questions about the use of the framework. Angie Cox mentions that we continue to revise our library faculty evaluation criteria, and this documentation could assist with that process. So re-looking at that evaluation criteria over time. LI mentions that for inclusion in our library faculty handbook for evaluation of scholarly creativity. So mentioned perhaps as a resource, it sounds like. Mantra Roy mentions, I wonder how tenure and promotion committees will view open access publications or contribution to OERs on campuses that don't have an open access mandate. And I'll just go through these quickly and then I'll pause so that we can have some responses. Aditi Banyopathide, sorry, I'm terrible with names, mentions that personally I would be using this guideline to build up my portfolio on scholarship. So as a personal use and planning, it sounds like for a scholarship portfolio. Cynthia mentions we are in the process of creating a rubric for librarianship evaluations. So this is great timing and will help us think about some aspects that might be missing. And I have a few more comments, but I'll pause there for a minute for any responses from Jennifer or Rachel.
So I
Rachel,
think
you want to? Oh,
Sure.
Sorry. Go ahead, Rachel.
No, you're fine. I was just going to comment on the open access thing, that I have that question as well. I think one of the big reasons we left this at the institutional level is because I think it's up to really the librarians at that institution as to what their own guidelines look like and what kind of case they can make to the administrators who might be using those guidelines. And I think a mandate is certainly part of it, but it doesn't have to be the only reason. And I think part of why ACRL published their support for open access was to help encourage inclusion of those kinds of values in institutional criteria. So I'm hopeful that between this framework and that statement that that institutions, and especially librarians at institutions that want to play a more active role in promoting open access, at least for their own scholarship, will now have some additional tools to do so.
There's another note that I missed earlier, pardon me, from Corey Craig. And this is about authorship order. And it says, I'm concerned about author order in the framework. First, practices for the order in which authors are listed vary among disciplines. Second, authorship is giving way, or at least making room for, a contributorship model. And there's a reference that is in the same chat post. Other examples, the credit taxonomy with 14 defined rules allows for transparency and recognition of author contributions, making order of authors listed much less important. So any comments about this piece of authorship order?
Well, if none of my other colleagues are going to jump in, I would say I think that's a conversation worth having in institutions, that I think probably disciplinary context is going to be a more important determination in the role that author order may or may not play. And as you can see throughout the framework, we did try and leave it vague enough that people could see themselves and their scholarship in the framework in different ways. But I understand that in some fields, author ordership matters, and that authorship order is not always the same from discipline to discipline. Sometimes it's last author, sometimes it's first, sometimes it's alphabetical. So I think this framework isn't going to guide everything, and there will always be a need to contextualize your own individual research, no matter what is included in institutional level guidelines or practice. So that's kind of how I would take it. And I'd be concerned if there was institutional guidance that said you must be first author, or we will always value first author because there are such disciplinary differences. But it is worth possibly including in something that is that you take a look at or is more valued in more general terms rather than prescriptive terms.
I will mention this also comes up in a comment from Charles Huber, who says authorship order seems a weak factor in some fields. As mentioned earlier, the PI goes last. So I suppose that if a framework becomes established in librarianship, we could learn to adapt. And I will just jump in as also a member of the committee to say that I like the idea. I think the overarching underlying, the main point is what Rachel is saying, which is it broaches that conversation about indications of how much work one has put into something like a publication. And if authorship order is a way of indicating that, I would think that the qualitative aspects of one's documentation would then explain that further. But if one has done significant work, isn't listed first author because of either traditions of the field or because there are lots of really heavy contributors, it still gives some weight to the idea that if you have contributed significantly to the work, you should be credited for that in some way by your institution. Couple more comments and questions here. Question from Kathleen. What is the driver behind splitting out types of impact? Impact is impact, no. Upon initial review, it strikes me as a false dichotomy.
All right, well, I'm happy to tackle this one as well. I don't think one envisioned it as an either or, but more of a yes and in some ways. That I think part of the problem that we were trying to address is exclusion of certain types of metrics that we see as being potentially useful indicators of types of impact that have not traditionally been I hate to say counted because that's probably too prescriptive, but have not been codified necessarily in our fields and in other fields. So this is more of a way to document something that's beyond what we've traditionally done. So for example, if your institution was one that happened to value citations or just publication in a traditional set of scholarly journals, that we now have other ways to describe how that scholarship is being used and impacting both our scholarship and our practice. And I think at the core of it is acknowledging that academic librarianship really straddles the line between scholarly and practitioner. And that's why the main reason behind, I think, why we chose those impact categories. But I would like to stress that whether this is useful or not is something that we'd like to get feedback on. And if we should reshift things entirely, that's definitely something that we're open to. But that was our main driving force. And again, that nothing that's in our framework is meant to be prescriptive, that it's more opening possibilities for demonstration of impact rather than limiting. So I hope that's helpful.
This is Robin again. I'm going to go through. We have a lot of really great chats that are coming through. Some of you are responding to one another, which I think is really great. And in the interest of getting to those, I'm going to just go through a few if that's okay with the presenters. A few other folks are mentioning how they might use it, referring to these guidelines again in updating their own dossiers has come up. Ellie mentions in response to Mantra's earlier question that their library has adopted an open access statement similar to ACRL's and will probably encourage open access publishing in their guidelines. We also had a comment from someone who was on the committee. I'm trying to find who it was now. From Claire, who said ACRL developed the OA recommendation actually to help where there were not institutional mandates. And she was the chair of this group when it was first drafted. There's also comments from Kaya at USF. We are consolidating and updating our evaluation and promotion guidelines. So this will be helpful as we try to make a case to administrators, so those outside the library. Will this framework be implemented into surveys like IPEDS, which I'm not familiar with, but others might be? I will pause for a minute if either of the presenters has a response to that.
I'm not familiar with that survey myself.
We can look into it. I can make a flag for it.
Yeah.
I mean, well,
hey,
no, I'm sorry, I misheard you. iPads. So yeah, I am familiar with iPads. So I haven't looked at it in light of iPads personally, but it's possible. I'd have to look at it more and get back to her about it in light of that. I really haven't thought that far into it myself. I don't know if Rachel has.
This is Alex, and I was going to mention that, I mean, all the data that our institutions report to iPads every year, I'm not certain that this is necessarily something that every institution is going to approach the same way, just as recording data from portfolios of faculty to then report further up. But it's definitely something that we could consider or be leery of.
Right. I think, again, it's another one of those, it invites conversation around, like, how would you like to implement this in your institution and what would that look like type conversations. But yeah.
I'm going to read two comments that include questions. The first from Heather Coates and the second from John Martin. Heather writes, I'm a bit concerned about the framing of specific metrics as either scholarly or practitioner in nature. We encourage librarians to think about the type of impact they'd want to demonstrate. For example, advancing knowledge, changing practice, then choose metrics that support their case. Many metrics can be used as evidence of either depending on the context. So if anyone wants to respond to that, you may, but I'll couple it with this other point from John Martin with a question. It's interesting to see that invited contributions are listed among scholarly measures, since many promotion and tenure guidelines I've seen from academic departments tend to devalue such contributions as being less rigorous than traditional peer-reviewed publications. He personally disagrees. How might librarians address this discrepancy in deciding how to evaluate invited contributions and in which category? So I'll pause there and see if there are any reactions from presenters.
So again, I think this is one of those things that the framework sort of encourages that type of conversation within each institution to determine like how that should weigh at your institution in light of the new recommendations. Like should that be part of your promotion and tenure? And what would that look like, and what would be acceptable, and how does that get recommended on your campus and that sort of thing. It could be something that is acceptable and should be acceptable on your campus, or not. I don't know, but I think that having the flexibility within the framework to make that possible is something that we were striving to do, as opposed to saying that certain things were not, available or possible.
I also just want to couple Heather's comment with Kathleen Spring's comment that I'm seeing about the visual representation of the framework and how it can come across as more rigid and prescriptive. And it's really good to hear that feedback. I think part of why we ended up with the framework is because that was what we said that we would do. But we definitely don't want to err on the side of it feeling as though it is more prescriptive than the intention. That said, if people have ideas of ways in which we can more accurately communicate this kind of values-based approach while combining with concrete ways to measure and advocacy for the institutional level, grappling with these different values and practices, I think that whatever we can do to help make this more applicable to a variety of situations without it feeling as though this is the way and there is no other way would be really welcome.
There's a lot of really healthy conversation, as I mentioned in the chat, and so I apologize that I'm skipping around a little bit to try and get through that. I'll just note that there were questions about archival and special collections. That is in the framework. Thank you for those who pointed it out, and as well as for those who pointed it out. Those of you who have been responding to some questions about OA publication, thank you for that too, since obviously that's in some of the specific questions on this slide. One question from Claire Stewart goes as such: I like the focus on impact and context. This is a conversation we're trying to have with our disciplinary faculty too. Curious if you explored community impact, considering how much community engaged research is a focus at our institutions. I'll just throw in here, it's interesting this comes up because I think one of the real challenges when it comes to community-based work or community engagement is that describing that in any regular terms it's so hard. It can be so many different things. And while we found in a lot of our research of like different disciplinary ways, different disciplines have tried to describe that, they basically just open the door to it and don't really try and fully prescribe it except in the effects that we would understand. So if it resulted in a grant in the process of engaging with the community, then that can be measured. But I think other than that, it's not that it goes outside of what this framework could. We hope this framework opens the door to that kind of work, but it gets really quite broad. And I'll give an example from my own institution. I'm at the University of Washington. Something that we did recently in order to try and encourage this kind of work and make it so it could be filtered into our own portfolios for P&T was we've created a time grant track so that if you want to engage with the community, you can write up a proposal to take time off of work, your normal work hours in order to do that. And then you write up a report and it becomes part of the library's overarching picture of how it serves the community. So it creates a document, it creates a way that you can then build and talk about that could be further discussed and built upon in more traditional ways. It's not sufficient, but I will just say for me personally, I found it something that I really am interested, but I don't think sits quite inside the framework given its focus on research, but I'll let others speak on that too. Actually, now that I said, I see Emily and Benjamin both mentioned grants. They say another omission they see is about grants, applying, receiving, and managing them. Did the community consider grants as impactful scholarship? And Benjamin also mentions the gap in grant writing.
So when we did our survey, one of the questions that we asked was about the different types of research outputs that should be included in the framework or that you personally saw as differentiated outputs. And I don't remember anyone mentioning grants. We can revisit that question in the survey, but our general thought is to be more inclusive than less inclusive. And to the extent that we have definitely gotten some comments of, I wouldn't consider this category to be scholarship in reference to some areas of the framework that exist currently, but that's definitely something that we can take into consideration of, should we include grants, and if so, what would the metrics look like there? And that's where I start to have more questions, because I'm not sure if a grant itself has impact rather than facilitating other research outputs. But at the very least, if we don't include it, we may, in our kind of full description that goes along with this framework, make some mention of it.
I will mention that there's some other, as I'm scrolling through, resources regarding community engagement that folks are pointing to, which is really great, as well as to iPads, and other folks who are making comments about how they would utilize or think this could be a helpful framework. There's suggestions about other resources to include, like the metrics toolkit in here, Campus Compact. There's a link to that as well, so thank you for that. There's a mention about how there used to be regular articles in CNRL about ranking of LIS journals, such as listing top tier or core journals. Those used to be used for reference, especially if you had published something that you wanted to list as a top tier LIS journal. Those studies are not available anymore, but they were helpful. Is there any attempt to look at what is top tier outside of traditional journal impact measures? That's from Laura.
I can take that one. Jennifer touched on it briefly when she was talking about journal metrics and specifically why they were not included in the framework, that we did find some of those articles that were driven primarily by peer survey to measure that prestige and reputation aspect. And just a side note, that second specific question, if anyone has thoughts, about these more general concepts of codifying reputation and prestige. Our first draft of the framework had references to it, which we took out because it can be fraught and not necessarily in line with EDI principles. But one of the recommendations that we plan on making is that ACRL could consider doing more regular peer surveys as part of the association, rather than relying on individual researchers to create the surveys, that it would create some more consistent context for people to draw on as we consider where to publish and the kind of reputation, et cetera, that's associated with publication in different venues.
And there are some more comments as well in the chat regarding this issue of top tier journals, if folks want to take a look. I just lost which question I was going to flag. There are a couple discussions of grants here. I'll note that other participants are mentioning that at their institutions, grants are seen as a research input, but are definitely factored into review, promotion, and tenure. Some folks mentioned that even declined grants that are submitted still count. I will say in my institution that's actually true as well. Grants are considered a major form of impact and research. And that's great feedback. Another comment that came through, sorry, I'm scrolling so far, more to do with the presentation, and I know, Rachel, you've touched on that, as have you, Jennifer. One suggestion here that I'll just mention, I think is quite clever, that in addition to maybe presenting it in a way that doesn't seem as rigid, the idea of adding a couple use cases to the framework would help institutions figure out how to apply them in a local context. And this is interesting to me in part because it reminds me of a few years ago, the NISO Altmetrics Initiative, which published a really great output that described the use of altmetrics in general and how they could be useful in a lot of different situations. And it also had a table, and there was a great effort to create use cases, in part because of that, to help really break down that framework into something that would be flexible. So that's a very familiar suggestion to me. Another thing I see is some of you are sharing information about your institution's guidelines for promotion, tenure, and review. And noticing differences, strengths, and gaps across them. This is something that I think was one of the best actions of being on this group, was the opportunity to really think about how not just one institution, but many different institutions encourage or shape librarian research and success. It's something I wish we could do more in the profession, and part of the reason this task force exists is to make it a little more transparent as much as we possibly can, so that we can acknowledge that there is no one definition of impact. There is no one way to be successful as a librarian researcher. So I just was really appreciative of seeing those comments. Let's see. Heather mentions, I would caution against relying on evaluation of journals. So more discussion about the pros and cons of having a top tier, and there's a lot of evidence about specific articles can better speak to impact, and that prestige is problematic as a construct for evaluating individuals. And then Ellie has put out a citation to the Cynthia Nixon article that's not quite on target in terms of non-traditional measures. It's based more on a survey of deans and directors' opinions, but it's a 2014 article in CNRL News, and that citation is at the bottom of the chat, so thank you. We've dipped quite a lot into some of the other questions on this slide. Presenters, is there a question or on this slide or a new question that you want to throw back out to our list of participants?
I can't think of any specifically. I do agree that the case uses would be a useful addition. I'm still trying to conceptualize what a framework that's not a framework would look like, pardon me, but how we can better package this information in a way that's useful, but also inclusive of all of this contextual information that is really hard to convey in framework form. So yeah, I see Sarah Hartman-Caverly is talking about a concept map, but as many ideas as people have of the best way to communicate all of this information in a way that's inclusive and not prescriptive would be really useful, so that we can kind of mull it over as a task force.
We just had some great thanks for the folks who put work into this, so thank you for those who mentioned that. And some, again, thank you, Sarah, and some other suggestions from Catherine about maybe combining the case use approach with organize it more based on the story you want to tell about your output rather than focus on individual output. So maybe it's just some more pieces of information around the framework or something else to help break up its predominance in its use. There's a question from Laura. It says, was there anything that came from scholarship guidelines that might be used for evaluating LIS faculty scholarship at library schools, such as from ALISE or ALISE? How do library schools look at evaluation of non-traditional research output / contributions?
I think that that's a great question. I'm not sure if it's ever going to be fully resolved. Sorry. Just because there are such a variety of expectations that I'm not sure if we're going to be able to provide meaningful guidance beyond what we've done that could be implemented at the LIS department level, other than having conversations among those faculty. I think maybe for the people that they're teaching, more making sure that they're aware of this rather than saying this is what you should do. And you know, one of the reasons again why our framework is so broad is that even 5 years from now, all of this could look very different. Yeah, sorry, those are all my thoughts. While I'm speaking, just to let you know that Lauren has nudged me that the recording of this webinar will be sent to all of you, all of the registrants, on Thursday, October 31st. And maybe it's a good time to also put up our last slide, though we will have some of these available. You've already gotten the first link, which is the framework itself. Our slides are available online. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that if you do want to see a little bit more about our background research that we conducted, more results from the survey, et cetera, that you can take a look at our ACRL slides as well. And that's that third link. And I think my last thought, since it seems like we are starting to wrap up here, is that if other people have major concerns, areas that we did not consider, such as format, specific outputs like grants, other values that we should be discussing, now is the time to raise those so that we can make sure that this final output, whatever it ends up being, framework or otherwise, ends up being the most useful for you and those around you.
I will just note that there's a lot of thanks being gone around, and I just want to throw back to that all of this is such great feedback. We really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here today, and we'll be going through this chat to look through all of your comments in more depth. I apologize if I didn't get a chance to read yours out loud, but we will be looking them over. Alex or Jennifer, any last comments or questions?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Same, Robin. Thanks so much. Just grateful for all the leadership and work that Rachel has done, amongst others, on the task force.
So it sounds like we're starting to wrap up. So I want to thank everyone for coming. And I agree, this has been a really useful and valuable discussion. And I'm really appreciative of everyone who had contributions to that discussion. I think we'll probably stick around for at least a couple of minutes to make sure that all comments, concerns, questions, etc., have been typed out, just in case we've got some people who are still typing.
And this is Alex again. I can just say too, in the background, I've been taking pretty copious notes on both the discussion and the comments, and then sort of the comments on the comments. So we hope that all of this information will go forward into the task force's work too. So thanks again for everyone for being here.
Okay, everyone. If you'd like me to stop the recording now, I can, or if you want me to leave it open for a couple more minutes, what do you think?
I think we're okay to stop recording.
Awesome. I'm going to hit the stop button.